Now in the wintertime, it is suitable to make a cookie jar to go with our winter quilt. So the cookie jar, we are going to cut a 5 by 10 inch piece of fabric. That way it depicts a 1 quart jar. And since my ruler is 5 inches wide, I can just lay it there and cut off this difference. So now that I have my 5 inches by 10 inches long piece of fabric, this is going to be the body of the actual jar. So in order to make this jar come full form, I need some 1.5" trim fabric. By 1.5" squares, we'll need 4 of those. Now we have our 4 little snowball pieces. And the way that we will do that, we're basically going to lay one on each corner of our square and just lay it from corner to corner and draw a line. A lot of times when it's this small, you can eyeball it on your machine, but just in case, it only takes a moment to draw a line. Or since I'm showing you, I'm going to pin them down. I generally just go and sew it. But since I'm taking you along with me on this winter quilt journey, I will go ahead and pin them into place and go ahead and draw my line. It's just so easy to follow that line. For me, it's a lot easier. And it shows you which direction to go in case you're watching the video and sewing along with me. And it keeps us from getting confused. And that way, if we do get vertical, we have a roadmap to go by. And this makes it so simple. And just a moment to do it. Place that. And then once again, this one is going this direction. That way we make sure that our angles are no longer a challenge to us. We take the math out of the equation. Right on that line, I'm going to sew directly down on that line. So now we've got these sewn at our angles, and we can cut that difference off before we iron this back. We want to press those back, so we want to allow that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what I do is I use my ruler. This is a 1/4 inch shading on this side. And all I have to do is lay those little crosses right on that line and then cut right down the side of it. It's just that little smidge coming off there because the rest of it is going to be tucked into our quilt. Now, let's go to the iron and press these back. We have our jar made and we've got it snowballed. Now we need to create a lid for our jar. Now we know that our block here is 5 inches wide. That's simple math. We need this piece to be 1.5 inches tall. And because we did our snowballs at 1.5 inches versus 1.25 inches, we can see right here that our body of our jar is showing to be 2 inches. The thing we have to bear in mind is we need to drop down at least 1/4 inch to see that width. We come down 1/4 inch into our block here and then measure how much body is showing, because when you sew your lid on, you are going to be coming in 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that is really going to show off what your lid is going to look like. To extend 1/4 inch beyond these snowballed shoulders to truly look like a lid. If we measure that, that's at least 3 inches. So we got to have at least 3 inches in length. If you wanted to ensure that it does look a little bit bigger, you could do a 3.5 inch in length. And then do your side background as 1.5 inch squares. And this needs to be 1.5 inch width. So let me cut myself a 3 to 3.5 inch section out of this. If you have these strips already made, for example, if you were going to make a Ispy quilt, which is of the jars, I've done that for my grandson in the past. It's beautiful. You do all these different fabrics. We already have our 3 inch piece, and we sew on our background pieces that are 1.5 by 1.5 squares, we are going to be reducing that by 1/2 inch on each side. I know this is small. If you're making the Ispy quilt though, you would make this strip in advance. In other words, you would do like a 1.5 background on each side of, say, a 3 to 3.5 inch strip. So you do your black, you'd have a white up top, and then a white at the bottom. You would have this whole long strip, and then you could cut your 1.5 piece out of that, which would be around 5 inches long. So let's sew our white squares on this side and one on this side to make the lid for our jar. I pressed these where the seam is inward. That way the black is really showing off, and I've got my background fabric. We just need to attach it. So we're going to go back to the sewing machine and we're going to attach our lid and just sew straight across the top. Press that seam towards the body of the jar. So that turned out pretty good. And as you can see, sometimes just get a little off like I did, or maybe just have a lot more white showing in the actual print, and it will still look fine. So I'm going to square up my block to make sure that my block is 5 by 10. And anything that's kind of wonky and hanging over from the strips, and sometimes when your fabric gets soft from the pressing and using, you can get little bits of these pieces, a little bit of fray. And this side looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit of resistance here on the shoulder.
Hello there, friend. Thank you so much for joining in the Winter Quilt Along, the Holiday DIY. The reason I've selected this as a first edition is it depicts and honors each one of those skills and craft ability that we naturally have in doing things ourselves, or it somehow becomes part of every holiday. The idea is it is a handmade item to wrap yourself in this quilt or lie it upon your lap and enjoy it during the winter season. This right now is at the beginning stage. It is basically a sketch on a sheet of notebook paper of blocks that I feel would be better represented as something that we as DIYers do. And I thought you would enjoy going along on this quilting journey with me. At this time, there are plans for this to be turned into a pattern that you will eventually be able to download. The great thing about you doing the quilt along with me is you are seeing it firsthand as it is in its true developing stage, in the raw, from block to block, as I put this lap quilt together. And as I am making this quilt, I'm finding that some of these blocks have developed on their own. A quilt has a way of talking to you and telling you what it wants to become, and therefore other blocks get iterated in the process. So it may end up being more than 12 blocks, or maybe some of these will be seen as an additional block, and that's fine too. The great thing about this quilt is you can take any one of these blocks and make it into a lap quilt all on its own, or you can follow this sampler of the Holiday DIY making the Winter Quilt Along quilt with me. Did want to cover that with you to kind of let you know what to expect and what to look forward to. And if you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe and add the Winter Quilt Along Holiday DIY playlist to your playlist, so you can go to it and you know each block as it comes out and be able to quilt along with me. This is Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining me.